Welcome back again to this week's MasterCoaches Wednesday Weekly Buzz. I'm Bob Bertucci, joined by fellow MasterCoaches Fran Flory, Mick Haley, and Bill Warren. We have two guests today that many of you know, two legendary coaches, Jim Stone, former head coach at Ohio State, and Tom Hilbert, the former head coach at Colorado State. And our topic today that we're going to eventually get to is who will be hosting regionals. But yeah, I hear some laughing in the background because it's going to take a little bit to get to it. And we're going to go ahead and start, with our two guests. This week, the NCAA is supposed to come out this weekend with their top 10 ranking of Women's Division I. So who are going to be those top 10? So we're going to find out from both Jim and Tom who they think the top 10 is, and then we'll have a little discussion about it. So welcome, you guys, and let's get started right away. Jim, why don't you take it?
I was going to see what Tom had to say first. Well, I have somewhat of a disclaimer. I haven't seen everybody play equally, so on some of this, I'm kind of flying with no RPIs or no numbers, just kind of the eyeball test. But from my perspective, there's three teams that are above the rest, clearly above the rest. Nebraska, Wisconsin, and Stanford, from my observation, have been playing at the highest level, and to me, they're distinguishing themselves from the crowd. Below those three, I think there's kind of interchangeable parts given, the weekend or the moment. So, do you want me to go through the whole list of 10 that I have?
Yeah, go ahead.
All right. So I have Nebraska 1, Wisconsin 2, Stanford 3. I was going to leave 4 blank just to underscore what I perceive to be a drop off. And then I have Washington State, which might be a reach, but they'll have a chance to prove themselves in the upcoming weeks. I have Washington State. I have Texas, Oregon 6, Louisville 7, BYU, who I haven't seen at all, but some people think they're doing well, at 8, Pitt at 9, and Arkansas at 10. So I differ a little bit from the AVCA, especially with Louisville. But like I said, I think beneath the top 3, the rest of those 10 teams, you could make a case for moving up or down depending on what somebody, what their biases are.
Tom?
All right. Well, I'm similar. And certainly my top 3 are the same. And, considering the match the other night, I think Nebraska deserves the 1 spot, Wisconsin 2. And I think if those two do the things they're supposed to do throughout the year, it's probably going to stay that way. And I also have Stanford as 3. I think they played a very daring schedule, played the best people they could play. They're doing very well. And I think they win out in the Pac-12. Then I have Louisville 4. I think Louisville's done a nice job. I think they had an interesting loss against NC State. But I would put them above Texas because Texas had an interesting loss against Long Beach State, who has a lower RPI than North Carolina State does. So I'm going Louisville 4, Texas 5, Washington State 6. And then after that, I have Pitt 7, Oregon 8, BYU coming in as number 9, and Arkansas is 10.
Very good. So there's a little bit of a mix there with you guys. Jim, what did you have? Who did you have for number 1?
Nebraska.
Nebraska. Okay. So I'm gonna go to Fran for a second and ask her thoughts, because we discussed this the other day and we had some different ideas. Not in the top 3, but as you get into that 4, 5, 6, 7, it got mixed a little bit.
Well, let's talk about Louisville, right? Because Louisville is, Jim and Tom have them at very different spots, right? And so their current RPI is 5. Their strength of schedule is 9. And this, I think to this point in ACC play, they're just kind of surviving. They barely got out of Wake Forest last week after going down 0-2, right? And they're tough-nosed, but they have some huge matches coming up. So, I think the Louisville is a question of where they're going to end up. But I certainly have the same top 3, very similar with these guys, where they're going. I have Louisville at 4, though, close with Texas. And then I have Pitt, I have Arkansas, and BYU.
Louisville just barely got out of Dayton also. They were down 2-0 and had a reverse sweep there.
Yeah, they've had a couple of reverse sweeps and the loss to NC State, right? And then, but their end of season schedule is going to give them a chance, right? They have Pitt on the road left. They have not played Georgia Tech yet either. They have 2 matches against Georgia Tech. And, that's their last 2 matches of the year, I think, are going to determine Louisville's fate, because that's what their schedule holds.
They also, they had an impressive win over Washington State, who I think is one of the top 6 teams in the country. So,
yeah, there's no doubt they deserve to be in there. It's just where will their schedule, where will they end up?
Right.
Well, and I think an interesting point here to what Fran's talking about and what Tom said is that out of all the remaining matches out of the top 4 conferences, the ACC has Louisville and Pitt have the largest number of matches against teams with high RPIs and ranked in the top 20. So they actually could improve their RPI standing much greater than Wisconsin or potentially Stanford or even Nebraska. If those 3 were to falter, the ACC teams' RPIs would potentially surpass some of those teams because of the quality of opponents they've got for the next 2 weeks.
Yes. And that's a big factor when you look at seeding. And that, when I was in the Mountain West, I remember years where we finished our first 4 weekends and we were 18 in the country in RPI. And then we went ahead and won our conference and our RPI still dropped to 35. So how your conference helps you with your ending RPIs is really critical.
Yeah, we discussed that a little bit last week when we were going over the polls, and it's a very difficult thing. Once you get into conference play, it depends on what your conference, how your conference is ranked, and that can have a major impact. But Mick, I know you had some thoughts on Washington State when we had our meeting in the beginning of the week. You want to discuss that and where you think they're going to fall out in terms of analyzing?
I'll do that, and I'll also take a stab at the guys going with both Big Ten teams as 1 and 2, because I think they can't improve themselves. The Big Ten is a 2-team conference this year, and people don't like to hear that, but basically it goes down real quick after those 2, and they're going to play each other one more time. So what I see is that they've logged themselves in as 1 and 2. However, if Wisconsin were to lose to Nebraska a second time, Wisconsin could fall all the way to 4. That would allow Nebraska to stay number 1 unless they don't stay undefeated in the rest of the conference. If they were to get upset by somebody, then they could move down. What I see is a little bit of a scenario like this with those 2. I see if Stanford will be number 2, not because I think they're number 2. I actually think Stanford's number 1, and I'll tell you why in a minute, but I'll get to Washington State. I'm going to get there. Hang with me.
That's why we had him last, because we knew it was going to take the longest, Tom.
Well, here's the thing on that first 3 spots. Stanford will be number 2 if Nebraska beats Wisconsin again. That's, I think, going to be pretty accurate, unless Stanford slips and loses to Washington State. And Washington State's got a chance to get Stanford, but it's at Stanford, so they got to travel. Now, Washington State, I saw the Washington State-Texas match, and Washington State was phenomenal. especially on defense. Plus, their transition offense was really, really good. I thought it was the best college match I had seen in a couple of years, at least. I just thought both sides played extremely well, and Washington State was just focused, and it was one of the best technical matches, lack of errors and good plays that I'd ever seen. So that gives me a hope that I want to push Washington State up, but I think the numbers are going to keep Washington State at 6 or 7, to tell you the truth, unless they do something to change that. And here's a little bit of information on Washington State. For instance, they are producing right now at a 13.8 kills per set and a 17.97 points per set. Anything under 18 usually does not make it to the final 2. And that's been over the last 5 or 6 years. Point production is a pretty good indicator, up to 95% of how a team is going to do. And why I like Stanford is, get this, they're producing at a 19.57 points per set. I mean, that's unbelievable that they produce that much. And they also have a 14.8 kills per set, and anything over 14.5 is awesome. So not only do they get their 14.5, actually 14.8, then they add another 4.5 points to that in blocks and service aces. Serving is a real positive for Stanford. So that's why I think Stanford's really the number 1 team. But I think in the polls, you're right, you're going to see Wisconsin or Nebraska up there because they've only got 1 match. On the other hand, that's a lot of pressure to go into all these matches and know you have to win. And you guys have been there with your teams when you're out in front and you're trying to keep them motivated and keep them focused, because you know what's going to happen if they lose. So that's the situation. But Oregon, Washington State's schedule is Oregon. They have Oregon coming up at number 8. They have Stanford at number 2. They have Cal at 47. UCLA at 44 in the RPI, USC now playing well at 32 in the RPI, Colorado at 50, and ASU at 20, with only 3 other matches below 50. So they have a chance to really produce here. Washington State could work their way back up into the top 4, actually, if they wanted to take business into their own hands. So they can actually do something about their situation. Only thing that Nebraska and Wisconsin can do is take care of business and then beat up on each other again and see what happens. I mean, that's a kind of an interesting deal. So in that situation, that's where Washington State is. I think they have the toughest schedule if they're going to try to win out. I think they have a very good setter. Their reception is average. Their serving is good. And I think they're well placed at 6 and 7 until they do something themselves. So I think you're real close with Washington State. All
right, Mick, well,
the information I have.
In analyzing, this stuff a little bit more, Tom, since you had a chance to watch the Wisconsin-Nebraska match with Kerry Pettit right next to you.
That's right.
I'm sure you have some insights about that. Of course, we have already discussed that match a little bit. So why don't you give us some insights about that? And Jim, jump in there if anything comes out that you'd like to mention.
Well, the way I saw it, Wisconsin came out a little bit jittery, which I think a lot of teams probably do when they're playing in Devaney. Nebraska sneaks out that first set. Then Wisconsin kind of took over, and Nebraska's youth started to come out. They started hitting a lot more unforced hitting errors. Wisconsin, to me, is the more physical and better blocking team, especially against pins. And then it looked like Wisconsin was just going to take over that match. And then Nebraska, just through pure competitiveness, and I think with help from the crowd and everything, sneaks out set 4. And then when you get in the 5th set, anything can happen. And we saw, different challenges and different calls and things happening. That was a very long volleyball match, but that match went over 3 hours. And so I thought it was a really good match. And I thought, Nebraska, the environment Nebraska was in was really much a benefit to them. And those young players, I think Wisconsin's a more experienced team, but Nebraska figured out a way to get it done.
And Jim, you've played both these teams many times. Any thoughts from you?
Well, I think both teams are better for having played that match. I think you walk into that atmosphere, and it's almost unusual when both teams do play well. So that's a heavy lift to walk into that kind of buildup of a match and go out and play great. So I think both teams benefited by the experience. It was a hard-fought, competitive match. I didn't think it was very well played for the reasons I just mentioned. And I think the next time they play, both teams will play better. I think they'll play cleaner, not as many errors. I was shocked that Nebraska won, given the amount of errors that they made. So I think both coaches could spin that match to benefit their teams. I mean, John could say, hey, we beat these guys and we'll never play that bad again. And, they'll work on this, that, the other thing. Kelly can say, we had that, we kind of gave it away, but we were right there in a tough scenario. We can beat those guys, so they can take a lot of positives away from that match. Getting back a little bit to what Mick said. Oh, I'll go back one thing about Nebraska. One of the reasons I was surprised that they won is, from my perspective, looking at what Nebraska is capable of doing offensively, the fact that so many balls went to the outside played right into Wisconsin's strength. I think if Nebraska is going to win next time, they have to attack the middle more. They have to go out of the back row more and get more diversity to their offense. And I think that's one of the reasons they were getting blocked so much is just their set distribution. And, you could say the passing kind of played into that, which I wouldn't necessarily disagree with. But going back to what Mick said, relative to Stanford, I think watching all three teams, actually quite a bit, those are the three teams I watched the most. I think Stanford's playing the best right now. I think they lack in depth. So who knows in the next month who's going to stay healthy, who's not going to stay healthy. I think Nebraska, but especially Wisconsin, they've got some moves they can make with their lineup if someone's not playing well or if someone gets hurt. I'm not sure Stanford does. So when all three teams are playing really well, that would be an exciting Final Four if those three teams make it, because there's some talented things going on all three courts.
Okay, well, Jim, you touched on the number of errors Nebraska had made in that match. Master Coaches, I know that we've discussed this a little bit. Who wants to jump in and tackle that right now?
Well, I would ask either coach, have you ever won a match making 44 hitting errors?
Well, yeah, I mean, they hit 13%, and that's just the hitting errors. I just looked at the score sheet, and if you add in the serving errors and passing or not passing errors, I think there were 0 passing errors, but they are pushing 60 errors, which is, and then to win the match, I mean, yeah, Coach Sheffield's got to be kicking himself, but that's how it goes sometimes. And like I said, I think it was the atmosphere more than the lack of skill. I think both teams are capable of playing better, and they'll do better next time.
So, Tom,
I would agree with
that atmosphere.
Yeah, I would agree with what Jim just said, and that they're going to play better next time. And this match was, it didn't hurt either team, I don't think. Obviously it benefits Nebraska to win, but the second match when they play each other is always the more important one when it comes to seeding and RPI and that kind of stuff. So, and they're going to have to play much cleaner, and they will play a lot cleaner. And, you see a match like this and you look at the overall stats and you're like, how the heck did that happen? But then you look set to set and you begin to realize, you know, what specifically happened in set 1, set 5, that kind of thing. So, and then the atmosphere, I mean, it's crazy. It's crazy to look at that on TV, and it's so great for our sport. And, you know, I certainly hope that other ADs across, not just the Big Ten, but all across the country are looking at that saying, hey, this sport can be something really special live. And let's figure out a way for everybody to do this. We could make money. We can have, you know, really serve our student athletes. I think it's just an amazing example. And then it's also, you know, I might also say that it was interesting watching that match with Pettit while he's eating a little charcuterie and he's seeing Terry Pettit court on the, you know, on the court right there going, oh, whose name is that?
Hey, I threw this to the master coaches Monday morning. I'll throw this to you for real quickly, but I have a thought about why Wisconsin lost, even though Nebraska had 44 hitting errors. Nebraska got stuffed 18 times. That leaves still about 26 hitting errors, not to mention the other errors that Jim pointed out. I felt Wisconsin didn't get to touch the ball enough. They scored so many points on the hitting errors that they really never got their right sides into it. A lot of balls to the left side. They really didn't get the number of sets that the other team got, Nebraska got. And I just felt like they never really got into the match. Do you agree with that at all? Or you think that's just...
Well, it was certainly a match that didn't have a lot of rhythm to it. The one thing on both sides, I thought the quality of the libero play was really good. And Rodriguez, you know, gets her kudos and well deserved. But the Wisconsin libero, Orzel, I mean, she was really good out of center back. But that's a little bit off topic. But to your point, Mick, I think you're right. I mean, the disparity, I don't have it in front of me, the disparity in terms of the number of swings was huge. So with the match being kind of choppy and there wasn't a lot of rhythm, and plus you're on the road, I could see where Wisconsin, it was like they were swimming upstream the whole time.
Yeah, it was interesting to me.
Certainly the last 3 sets they were swimming upstream.
And I'm sorry, I'm bad with names and I should have written this down, but Nebraska's outside hitter that's a freshman. She had a great set 5, a really great set 5. And that's to your point, Mick, is that, you know, that's not expected by Wisconsin. She comes out and gets a lot of kills and is very effective in that set alone. And that made a huge difference.
Yeah, well, Nebraska hit under 100 and then hit 545 in the 5th.
Mm-hmm.
To go to one of Jim's points, let's do a hypothetical. I think that the score was 24-21 Wisconsin, and the big right side, the 6'9" girl, Schmreck, had a swing, I think, either for match point or the 24th point, I don't remember, but she flamed it out of bounds. And we've all seen a hitter just hit it into the second row for game point. But had she killed that ball and the score ends up 25-21, and you see the stat sheet and you see Wisconsin wins 3-1 and you see all those errors from Nebraska, what are we saying today about Nebraska if you eliminate the anomaly of the match, which was their 5:45 fifth game set? Because they didn't play like that the whole night until the 5th.
Don't get into a 5th set.
That's right.
They got that kind of figured out, huh?
Right. But my point is where would Nebraska be sitting today had they lost 3-1 with all those errors, and what would people have had them ranked coming out today?
That's a very good point.
Mm-hmm. Because if they go to Wisconsin and aren't able to play in the first 3 sets, they get beat 3-0. What happens to them? Because that's the second to last match of the year for Wisconsin. So what happens can Nebraska stay in the top 4 if they lose 3-0 to Wisconsin?
Oh, I think for sure. Top 4 for sure. In assuming that both teams went out. and Wisconsin's got to play Penn State on the road. They play Purdue twice, so they have some speed bumps in front of them. But I think if both teams, if Nebraska loses big time or Wisconsin loses, I go back to what Nick was saying earlier. I think it'd be easy for Stanford to start leapfrogging these teams, and well deserved, because Stanford is playing good enough to do that.
Jim, you said something that just struck right in my heart when you said any of these three teams could win the national championship. In 1988, the Final Four in Minneapolis was UCLA 35-0, Hawaii 34-1, and Illinois at something like 32-2 or 3. And Dave Soji put in the paper that any one of the three teams can win. They thought it was three best teams in a long time. And well, guess who won? Texas in 6 straight sets. But that's what we're looking at this time. Everybody's looking at those three, and who's the team that's coming that's going to be hot at the end of the year that can pull this off, because it's going to be a feeling. And I don't think anybody out there is saying there's a fourth team right now that's playing at this level. The stats would indicate there's not a fourth team. The only team that Fran pointed out is got the capability is a team that none of us put in the top 10, and that's Tennessee. They're second to Stanford in differential points scored versus points given up, and they're scoring at 18.96 points per set. That is a pretty amazing stat, and they're not even in first in the SEC conference right now. What if that team gets hot? And we haven't even talked about them. So there's some additional teams maybe that we should be looking at here, and Louisville's one of them. Louisville's got a chance to either move way down or hold their position and let these other teams kind of self-destruct or produce. They've got 3 really quality matches, 2 at Georgia Tech, 2 with Georgia Tech, and 1 with Pitt, like you mentioned. And they've got some other, I wouldn't guess the other ACC teams. Maybe Florida State's a little could fire up one night and really get after somebody, but I don't see Miami doing that. I don't see North Carolina State doing that. So I think that's where that one is. But the SEC, you've got Auburn, you've got Arkansas, you've got Florida that you shouldn't count out yet. They've got talent. They're just trying to get their setting fixed right now. We don't have Florida in the top 10. And BYU has only played Texas twice and lost twice, and they're not going to be challenged in the conference, I don't believe, by anybody else. And, when you look at the differential, guess who comes in at the top 10 is Kansas at almost a 3.9 differential, which is everybody others. 9 other teams in 4-point differentials, and Kansas is next at 3.9. Nobody's talking about Kansas. So I think it's kind of interesting.
All right, well, Mick, let's change gears here for just a minute. We'll come back to a little bit more analyzing and upcoming matches, which will bring out some more analyzing at the end. But our goal here is, or our topic is, who will be hosting the regionals. All right, and as of right now, the top 4 seeded teams are supposed to be awarded a hosting opportunity. Other than pure performance, are there other factors that go into the selection of the 4 regional hosts? And I'm talking about geographical location, size of the venue, attendance at a venue, television market. Is television having anything to do? Time zones. Are we going to divide this Final Four up equally amongst the country now that we have 1 and 2 being Nebraska and Wisconsin? Jim and Tom, do you guys have any feelings about that before I go to the master coaches on it?
Well, they say those other factors are not involved, but the factor that basically it's just the performance and rankings of teams. And, who knows if those things are true? I've never sat in on one of those meetings with the NCAA championship committee, but I would say to trust them and say, no, this is going to be about how these teams rank at the end of the year.
So right now, Texas is third in the RPI.
That's right. They're
Do you
fifth
think
in the
committee is
KPI.
going to keep them in the top four?
Well, and they have basically two. I think they play Baylor twice, and
Both at
and then-
Texas. Both
yes,
at
and
Texas.
and everything else for them should be a win, if I'm not mistaken. So,
Baylor's
but-
not scoring 17 points a set. I wouldn't
No.
think Baylor is even going to give them.
right. So Texas has an outside shot. So I don't know. And Mick, you've seen a lot of these different NCAA tournament seedings, and I'm sure some that'll left you scratching your head. But do you think there's outside factors that when they get in that room, they talk about?
Boy, I don't know, but I think it's changed from in the past. So it's hard for me to draw too much. But it used to be, well, if we did this, we could send so many teams there, it wouldn't cost us as much and that sort of thing. I think they're pretty much committed. The committee's pretty much committed to seeding the top 16.
Mm-hmm.
All right,
And I
Jim, do you
think
feel like
that's-
any of these factors I mentioned would play a role at all in their selection or their ranking? And then if they rank it a certain way, then that's their top four, and then they can seed them and let them have a host.
Yeah, I mean, I've been out of it for long enough where I don't feel I have a great deal of expertise when it comes to this, but I certainly hope not. I mean, you have a team like, for example, Washington State. If they beat Stanford and beat Oregon, well, there's about as isolated geographically as you can get. So do you turn your back on a team like that when in reality, if they were to host, they would draw well? I mean, they do a good job in Pullman. So you hope for the betterment of the game and to be some sort of spirit of fair play, that whatever you do on the court is going to talk louder than anything else.
I think there's only 2 flights into Pullman each day. 8 a.m. and 6 p.m. or 9 p.m.
I'll throw another factor in, Mick. I'll throw another factor. Maybe Fran could speak to this point. How much does committee members influence the seating and the selection, and can that be a factor? I mean, I'm looking at a sheet right now that has 10 people that are on the committee, and it looks pretty spread out. I mean, in terms of, SWAs and commissioners from different conferences that it seems like it represents the whole country, but can that make a difference?
I do think it can make a difference. And I was actually on the beach selection committee. So I have walked through this process in a much smaller range with fewer eyes on us, right? But the process is the process, and teams are compared in every way possible. And then certainly the committee votes. Now, if your team is involved in the discussion, you literally leave the room. You are not allowed to be in the room or part of any of that discussion. So immediate teams, administrators or former coaches or whoever's on the committee related to a specific school, literally they are asked to leave. And then when they come back, they either tell you you're in, you're out, or you're still on the table for discussion. So that part is handled very, very well. And I honestly think the evolution of the investment of administrators, coaches, and committee members in our sport, because our sport has grown so much recently, I think it's at the highest level it's ever been. And I think it has to be, because there's so many polls, there's so many people, there's so many eyes watching, that the credibility of their decisions are being scrutinized at the highest level ever. And so they have to be pure. They have to have a reason. In the past, sometimes they just said that was their decision. That's why they chose. That's what they did. And we all had to live with it. But I think these days, there is a rationale behind every decision they make. So I do think it's a better process. Is it perfect? No. And no sport is perfect, but I do think it's better.
And any other thoughts from anyone else? Because I know I played at Penn State about half a dozen times, year after year, and was wondering why I never went anywhere else.
Well, you made the mistake of beating Russ once, and so they thought they'd send you back each first and second round.
They'll keep doing it.
Spice up that first and second round at Penn State.
Well, whether it's true or not, I think that if you got Wisconsin sitting at 3 or 4, and you have another team sitting at 5 or 3, if they stick Wisconsin at 4, the voices that criticize them will say they did that so that Nebraska and Wisconsin have to play so that the same two schools from the same conference can't be in the championship match. That's what people will say. And whether that's what they did or not, that's besides the point. Because right now, Wisconsin's sitting at 4 in what I call RPI futures. And if they finish at 4 and Nebraska finishes at 1, and then they have to play each other in the semifinals, everybody will be saying, well, the committee did that because they don't like the Big Ten and they don't want 2 Big Ten teams in the Final Four.
Well, in 2002, we played Stanford, though, in the finals.
When you say that, Mick, you got to make sure they know if you're talking USC or Texas.
USC. both Pac-10 teams at the time, not Pac-12.
Right, but were one of you seeded 1 and one of you seeded 4th?
No, I think we were pretty close to 1 and 2.
Right, so that 1 and 2 means you played each other in the finals, so they didn't seed you, so you'd be opposite. So
we had split during the season. We had 1 at Stanford and they had 1 at USC.
So the question is, I'm just talking about the ether. Will the ether complain that people are working against the Big Ten?
I think
the
ether complains about a lot of things. I'm not sure that shouldn't be a driving factor.
My Final Four is 2 Big Ten teams, 1 ACC team, and not Final Four, but the regionals. 2 Big Ten, 1 ACC, and 1 Pac-12. That'll be your regional hosts.
So you would have an East Coast time zone, 2 Midwest time zones, and 1 West Coast time zone.
Exactly. That's what I see happening.
Say if Texas were to sneak in there, or even Washington State were to sneak in there in that 4th spot, or even the 3rd spot, you would have 2 Midwest time zones and 2 West Coast time zones.
Correct.
Or even Pittsburgh. We haven't said much about Pittsburgh, but if they take Louisville out in this next matchup at Pittsburgh, I believe, then their matches with Georgia Tech I think they have 1 more match with Georgia Tech. So
yes, in fact, the Louisville Pittsburgh schedules are almost identical to the finish, and it would be feasible that Pitt could switch with Louisville if they were to win all those matches and Louisville lose a couple. I think Pittsburgh and Louisville switch places.
I think what Bob was trying to get to, though, Jim and Tom, is that do you think the RPI is the thing, or do you think the KPI, the basketball RPI, basically done by the basketball guy at Michigan State, is a better judge of where the teams are? Or would you use the RPI, the KPI, the AVCA coaches poll, what are you going to use as the determiner of where the teams are ranked? Because everybody could go in with a different idea of a ranking. What's the one ranking? The RPI, is that going to be?
I think the RPI and the KPI are both going to be used. To me, I like the KPI better because I do think there's a home and away difference, and that ought to be factored in. I think they also did, if I'm not mistaken, they still use the regional rankings that are done through those regional committees, and use all of those and they don't use the coaches poll because I don't think they think the coaches poll is legitimately, a power ranking. But anyway, but as I would through the course of the releases of the RPI and KPI, I feel like the KPI is better. I think it's more true to what's going on.
So if it comes out this week, the top 10 by the committee's going to put out their top 10, and that should give us an idea of what they think the top 4 are.
Yeah.
And Texas ends up in 3rd or even in 4th. We've got to assume that they're looking at the RPI or the KPI. Is that what you guys think?
I would think so.
KPI has Texas at 5.
Yeah,
today.
and RPI has them at 3. And so,
Right.
it's really interesting when you start looking at those factors and what you think are fair factors. And as coaches, we all just want our teams to be in there, and we don't care.
Can I ask a quick question? I want to get your guys' opinions on this. The fact that the Big 12 is still playing a schedule where they play double matches against a certain opponent. Texas played BYU twice in a row already. Does that help that conference or hurt them?
I asked that question last week. We had Kevin on, KPI guy on, and I asked that question. I said, should conferences double schedule with the top 5 or 6 teams and single schedule with the bottom team? He said, absolutely not. That actually will hurt you. And I never got to ask him why, but that was his response. He said that the Big 12 schedule probably, if I interpret what he said, is not helping them.
I think what Tom's referring to is that they're playing the old COVID schedule where you don't have potentially some teams at home. You just play them you only play them on the road.
They're only playing the good teams against each other twice. And for instance, if they have 12 teams in their conference, the top 6 are playing each one twice, and then they're playing the bottom 5 once.
Right, but in KPI, you get more credit for winning on the road. So if Texas plays Kansas twice at Kansas and wins both of those, they get a better bump in their RPI than if they play them once at home and once away.
Right.
But
I also think there's tactical and coaching things, like if Wisconsin and Nebraska were playing each other on back-to-back nights, that's a lot different than the way they're doing it now. And they get to see each other now, then they've got, a few weeks to prepare themselves to play again. And I also think I think it's better for our fan support as well. To me, it would seem boring to play people twice in a row.
Yeah, I think it's the worst thing that we've stayed with. The Sun Belt Conference does that too, and I think it's terrible. The fans are really disadvantaged because they only get to see about 5 teams or 4 teams in the conference.
Right.
They don't get to see all 9 or 11 teams in the conference. And the way we're drawing now with crowds at 7,500 to 10,000, and this is amazing how many of these crowds. Remember when 2,500 was a big deal and we were talking about it, and now 7,500 is kind of an average deal, and 10,000 and up is a good deal, 13,000. So I think there's reason to want to better your schedule at home, wouldn't you think?
Yes.
Yeah, and Mick, I think when Kevin was speaking about this in terms of hurting yourself, he's really speaking about the conference. So the example Tom gave might actually help, or Bill mentioned about Texas playing Kansas away could really help them with 2 wins. But when you look at over the course of the whole conference, it doesn't help the whole conference, I think was what Kevin was saying about, the way it's weighted through KPI.
Well, get this. Texas played Kansas, played BYU, going to play Baylor, all at home twice.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so
Jim,
before we go into looking at
Bob,
the upcoming
Jim had a
matches.
comment.
No, I just had a question. Are conferences doing this for financial motivations, or what's the driving force behind it?
That was originally the reason, but I don't know if that's why they stuck with it.
I think the Big 12 is mad at Texas and Oklahoma for leaving and didn't want to let them play as many home games.
Well, they sure gave him a nice schedule. Baylor's the one that got screwed in that deal, I'll tell you that. And they're still in the conference. So
Jim, your top seeded teams, would that be the same? Would you go on a pure performance right now for the teams that are going to be hosting regionals?
Well, I would, but the disclaimer I have is I've been kind of out of it to the point where I'm not as dialed in with the RPI and KPI. I mean, that is out in the distance for me. I'm in my living room with a cold frosty beverage going, that team's no good.
You meet Tom at Whole Foods and he's getting the wine and you're getting the beer.
We talk about the weekend matches.
I think there's a huge number of people, Jim, a huge number of people who want to hear what your eye test view is, because I think lots of people prefer the eye test to the numbers.
Well, like I said, I think Stanford, Nebraska, Wisconsin have separated themselves. And 3-2-1, 1-2-3, I could live with either one. As I said earlier, I think Stanford's playing the best right now. The thing I have, not against Louisville, I think that their challenge is going to be, I think Louisville is extremely well coached and they compete like nobody's business. I think against the top teams, you throw Texas in there. I think Washington State to a degree, they have trouble matching up physically. I think that would be, the hurdle that they have. So the three that I mentioned, and then my 4-5, 5-4 would be Washington State or Texas. I think Washington State has, as Mick mentioned, they've got enough chances to move themselves up that either the cream will rise to the top or not. But I think if they can beat Stanford, they can beat Oregon. They've beaten Texas head to head. So to me, they would be a 4 seed.
If they lost to Stanford, though, it wouldn't be a negative for them, right? That's where I see the Stanford is a gift match for them because they're supposed to lose to Stanford.
Yeah, I think they play Oregon twice, actually.
I have them only playing them once.
You might be right. But I think that's a bigger match for them.
Yeah, I agree.
Than the Stanford match.
And Tom, how about your 4? Who do you think's going to be?
Well, the same top 3. I think Wisconsin, Nebraska, and Stanford. The fourth one, to me, if it were played today, I think it'd be Louisville. And I think Louisville has, they own their own destiny here. They play a nice, tough schedule, and they play teams that if they beat, will keep their RPI high. And I think they're going to do it. So I think it's going to be Louisville.
What if Louisville and Washington State both went out? Just hypothetically.
Yeah, well, and Louisville beat Washington State head to head. So I think Louisville would stay up there. But Washington State, if Washington State wins out, certainly, they're going to be a contender. And I watched the same match, Mick. I thought they looked great. They're really, really mature looking as a team, and they're the kind of team that I think it can make a run at the end, where regardless of where they're seated, and end up in the Final Four.
They have a mature team. They play like a mature team.
Yes.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank both Jim and Tom for taking time out of their schedule, adjusting their shopping routines so they would have time today to be on the call with us. All right. We really appreciate it. And thanks very much. We'll definitely like to have you guys back again. And we really respect and believe in your knowledge and the information you'll put forward to the coaches that are viewing this. So thanks again.
Bet.
Very good.
Take care.
Enjoy the last Nebraska-Wisconsin game with Coach Pettit.
Okay.
You all three should get in the same room. That would be fun. That would be funny.
Do you know how many? There's other former Division I coaches living in Fort Collins too. Scott Swanson's here.
How many? You should have a watch party.
It's like 6 of us. I know. It's crazy.
Gosh.
Yeah.
You've got Cindy Frederick, Scott Swanson.
Oh my!
Linda.
That must be the place to retire to, I guess.
That's right.
All the cool people go.
That's right.
That would be a great watch party.
I didn't know that. I didn't know that's where the old folks' home was for college coaches. I'm getting my RV and headed that way.
Oh, my.
Thanks, guys.
All right, thank you.
Good, guys. Good show. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, Fran, as part of our buzz reaction, I'm gonna let you start first because I know we wanted to look at some of the upcoming matches, and I know that you have a couple of teams that are in that top 10 area that you've looked at their schedules and have some ideas on where they might end up. So why don't you go over those first?
Yeah, I think, Oregon is a team that is going to be on the bubble. And the three teams I have left, we've talked about Louisville a lot. The three teams I have left are Oregon, Arkansas, and Florida. And they're right on that bubble of where they're going to be. Oregon only, they're 17-4. Their RPI of 8. Their strength of schedule is 17. So can they bump into that top tier? I don't know that they have it. The interesting part, they have 4 losses. All 3 of their losses in October were at home. So to Washington State, Arizona State, and Stanford. So they get a chance to get all 3 of those back, but they'll be on the road late in the season. And can they pull that off late in the season? It's going to be a huge ending with some good opportunity, of course, but a pretty challenging end for that team to get into the top. If you talk about Arkansas, who was running through the SEC all the way until last weekend, ran into a Kentucky team that's hungry to prove a point that they belong and then they can win the SEC again. 5-set loss, a great match. I mean, it was close. Just couldn't quite pull it off on the Arkansas side. It was at Kentucky, and that match will happen again at Arkansas later in the season. They've only lost besides that to Wisconsin twice. So those are their only losses in the season. They're a pretty balanced team. And their last 3, all of these teams that I'm talking about, their last 3 are the key matches in the season and to finish up where they're going to end up seeding. And Arkansas has Florida and Kentucky at home, and then they have Auburn on the road as the last match of their season. The home matches shouldn't be a catch match, but Auburn could be a catch match at the end of the season for them. That's may determine the SEC champion. And then you talk about Florida, who's still, as Mick mentioned earlier, reeling, still trying to fix the setting thing, but they're getting better. They've had some bad losses, and I think I have them lower than everybody else because, the losses that they've had. They lost to A&M, Auburn, not a surprise, but they also lost to Mississippi State, which is, typically Florida gives one away at the season every year. And that's the one I think they probably just gave away. But they have Arkansas twice, they have Kentucky twice yet, and they get one shot at Tennessee this year, and that's upcoming as well. So they have a lot of opportunity with those teams that maybe are viewed ahead of them to climb, but they also have a lot of opportunity if they don't pull it off to kind of move their way out of discussion for those spots.
Okay, thanks, Fran. Mick, you got a couple of teams you're looking at a little closer.
Well, actually, I talked a little bit about Washington State. I think the things that I found out about them is they're so evenly balanced, and I can't pronounce all of these names, but Isanovich, Larova, Radakovich, all are producing 3 points per set. In other words, they have 3 players at 3.61, 3.87, 3.49, and 2 middles at 2.84 and 1.93. I mean, they're scoring a lot of points. They are legitimately dangerous, and if they can stay in the moment, and they have an experienced 50-year setter who was at Washington, who was at I don't know where Ung was from. I'm sorry, that I was thinking of the Oregon setter, but Ung is an experienced setter, and she's very good. She runs the show. They don't seem to miss the kid that transferred to Oregon. So I think they're really good. We talked about their schedule. I think their reception is one of the areas that they really need to work on. I think they'll move down if they don't take on this schedule, and it's a tough schedule. Let me tell you, they're playing as I said, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 teams that are going to be in the tournament. And think about that. The Pac-12 is getting 8 teams in the tournament, or at least if Colorado sneaks in, that will be the 8th team. But that's a lot of teams. And you're looking at the Big Ten right now at maybe 4. Probably somebody will let the 5th team in, but the 4 is all I can see right now. And we've got, we got 8 weeks of players, 4 or 5 weeks of play yet. But so that's interesting. The other team I have is Texas. And Jim Stone asked this off the air, but everybody's trying to figure out what's the deal with Texas. Well, I'll tell you what the deal with Texas is they score with anybody else. But what's happening is they can't seem to defend. And when you watch them, you think, wow, they got a great block, all of this stuff, but it's either the passing or it's the backcourt defense that's allowing their differential. They're on the differential way down to 12. Their differential is only 2.08 compared to, let's say, a Nebraska that's 4.6, or a Wisconsin that's 4.9, or a Stanford that's 5.7, or a Tennessee that's 6.34. I mean, when you see those kinds of differentials, Texas has a tendency to give up long runs, 3, 4, 5 points, and use 2 timeouts in the process. That means to me that they can't win unless they fix that. It could be the freshman setter, but Nebraska has got the same problem at freshman setter. Maybe that's why they didn't run the middle as much. She wasn't as comfortable. Maybe that's the reason Texas only runs certain plays. Texas doesn't seem to run threes. Just last week, for the first time, the setter started setting threes and connecting. So it might be something they're working on, trying to vary their offense. But that's a situation for Texas. They might get ranked higher than maybe some other team that might deserve to be higher. The RPI has got them at 3. I don't know if that's scheduling, but I suspect. The KPI, which we all, at least many of us, feel is a little bit more accurate, has them at 5. And I don't see Texas having any way to move up, but they have every way to lose. So they really have the pressure on them to have to perform as being out in front right now. So that's kind of their situation, with Washington State having maybe the toughest schedule, having to move up. And then Stanford, everybody seems to agree that Stanford's pretty darn physical. I think Jim pointed it out. They're an injury away from being a Florida. But boy, I didn't realize that Rubin was scoring 3.5 kills per set and 4.24 points per match. Rubin is doing a much better job than I thought. I thought Baird would be their big scorer. She has less kills per set, 3.29, and scoring 4.04 points per set. That's still huge. We'd all like to have people scoring 4 points per set. And then Kip is scoring 4.3 kills per set and 5.24, 5.25 points per set. Think about that. They've got 1 5-point scorer, 2 4-point scorers. Francis is a 2.73 point scorer, and Vicini, the other middle, is 1.5, and they're anchored by a sophomore setter, Cami. Help me with Cami's last name.
Minor,
yeah, Cami Minor, who is really good sometimes. She was particularly good, maybe her best match against Texas when Stanford beat Texas 3-0 at Texas. That was the highlight, and maybe not as good when Nebraska beat Stanford 3-0 at Stanford. So that's interesting. I think my analysis of Stanford is they must win out, and they can move up only depending on what happens between Nebraska and Wisconsin. That doesn't mean they're not the best team, but it means they're kind of locked in at this point. So
all right, well, Bill, you have Nebraska and Wisconsin, and we've talked a bunch about them, and obviously their upcoming match is going to be at Wisconsin. What else do you see with the teams you were looking at?
Well, I agree that there's some conference teams that can only move down, they can't move up, and that can be a deterrent. But if the second part of the season matches the first part of the season, I think the only thing that will happen different between Wisconsin and Nebraska is Wisconsin wins at home and they're split. But then Nebraska's win over Stanford could move Stanford down to 3, because then Wisconsin and Nebraska end up 1 and 2, and they move Stanford to 3 because of the loss to Nebraska. But Nebraska's got Penn State at Penn State coming up. That could be a little blip in the road. Penn State's got enough arms, and if they're at home, maybe they can finish. Penn State's problem hasn't been scoring points. It's been scoring points in the last quarter of the game from 20 to 25. They break down when it's finish line time. And then they're at Wisconsin and they finish with Minnesota. And Minnesota's a team with an injured setter, but Minnesota had some good wins early, and then they're struggling here in the middle, but they've got enough arm power to come back and give Wisconsin some trouble on the last match of the year. I mean, Nebraska some trouble at the last match of the year. Wisconsin's got Minnesota coming up, Purdue 2 times. Illinois got the number 1 outside hitter in the conference in Rainey. And if Illinois at home gives any trouble to Wisconsin, they could jump up and beat Wisconsin if they're looking past Illinois, because Illinois is their match before they play the final against Nebraska. So that's what do they call that when you're the team before the big match, And Pitt's got the best chance to move up. Pitt is got a bunch of RPI teams in front of them. They've got Miami twice, Louisville, Georgia Tech, Florida State, and North Carolina State. And now North Carolina State has a win over Louisville. So if Pitt sweeps the end, if they go undefeated at the end and they finish by beating Louisville and Georgia Tech, I think Pitt moves ahead of Louisville potentially into that 4th or 5th slot in the top 4. So, and of course, if Louisville falters and Pitt moves up, that even helps Texas stay in that top 4 spot. Helps them go from 5 to 4.
So
but I'll tell you,
we pretty much have the top 3 teams. Everybody seems to agree with Stanford, Wisconsin, and Nebraska. Not necessarily in that order, but all 3 of those are going to be hosting. It's the 4th team that's going to be hosting. Is where we see. Well, of course, it could change. We still have, like as we just outlined, some important matches coming up. But who does the group feel like is going to be that 4th regional site right now?
Well, I'm going to say eye test. I think it could be Washington State. I'd like to see it be Washington State, but I think the 4th slot's going to be in the ACC. That's my opinion.
Fran?
I think it's going to be Texas. I think Texas is coming, and I think I would not be surprised to see Texas as number 4.
Nick?
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised to see Louisville or Texas be number 4. I mean, I think it's a flip. It's just the committee's going to have to find minutia to select between those 2, unless somebody slips here before the committee reconvenes. If nobody slips, Louisville wins out, Texas wins out. That means that Pittsburgh has lost. That means that Oregon can't get close enough. Now, Washington State's the one that both of those teams could do exactly what they were out to do. They could win out, and Washington State, if they win out, they could move into 4th. And I do believe that's a possibility, but that's a huge order, because Washington State would have to be high enough to beat Stanford and then protect enough not to lose to Oregon, and then play all those mid-level teams that are going to be in the tournament that they might see in the 1st, 2nd, or 3rd rounds, or 3rd or 4th rounds that, wow, it's interesting. But that's my thought. Just this is going to be great to watch, and we even have some great matches this week, Bob, that people can tune into, and they don't necessarily take in Nebraska or Wisconsin or Stanford for the most part.
Okay, well, I think that wraps it up for this week. Bill, if Washington State wins out all the way through, and we'll see if those other factors that we talked about earlier play into the selection. Because if there's only 2 flights going out to Pullman, I'm not sure they're going to want to have a regional out there.
Well, Spokane's an hour away, so they can go
Okay.
to Spokane.
All right, well, great job. You know, again, we're gonna have the showcase. It's already been advertised a couple of times on the AVC at the net. And of course, it's on our website if anybody's interested. I know that the junior college is just starting to wind down now. In fact, last night I saw a player from a junior college team out of Harrisburg that was unbelievable. I mean, attacking. When she tagged the ball, it was as good as any Division I player I've seen. So until next week, we'd like to thank all our viewers and listeners for following us, and we'll see you next Wednesday.